Okay, so I'm going to talk about ESG, which we've covered in very brief amounts throughout the presentations that we've given over the last 5 months. But I thought we'd take a more direct look at what it is and why it's important to consider. So let's start with looking at a company that's quite well known in the UK fashion industry, Boohoo. Now, I don't do fashion. I don't know if any of you know that, but you all definitely do. But Boohoo are a fashion company. And in 2019, a report came out that they were paying some of their UK workers in their Leicester garment factories as little as £3.50 per hour, which is obviously well under what minimum wage is and constitutes slave wages. Now, when this report came out, obviously that's pretty terrible from an ethical standpoint, but from a financial standpoint, the investors in the company were not in a good state. The stock price halved over the next fortnight because people don't want to be involved with a company that are paying slave wages. This wasn't the end of the Boohoo slavery saga, though, and this year, in fact, ongoing at the moment, they are facing a possible US import ban based on the same set of issues. So they haven't improved the situation, and now the US is considering banning them from selling their products there. Now, this would be a massive blow for Boohoo because more than a fifth of the company's total revenue last year was in the US. So them trying to make short-term profit by taking morally or ethically bad decisions pays off in the short term because they get cheaper labor, which means they can maximize profit. But in the long term, they're looking like they might start to be banned from selling in major markets. So what this shows us is that companies are now going to have to start looking at more than just the financial aspect of things. They have to start looking at a broader picture of how they interact with the world. And this is where ESG comes in. And so ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, although I like to think of it more as corporate governance because that makes it a bit clearer. And it is the idea of taking a look at all the different aspects that a company has an impact on during its performance and during its activities. So environmental factors would be things about how it affects the environment. The social factors are how it interacts with people and their relationships with people. And governance is as to how the company is run by its managers and by its executives. So we're going to take a look now at some examples of each of these. So the first one, environmental, is all about, as I say, is all about the conservation of the natural world. And this is looking at things about how are companies combating or contributing to climate change and the effects of it. Are they contributing with lots of carbon emissions? Are they causing lots of air and water pollution? Is there energy production? Is there energy coming from sustainable sources? Are they doing things to offset their carbon emissions? All of this sort of thing comes under the environmental aspect of ESG. Might be looking at things like oil companies spilling oil in the Gulf of Mexico, things like that. The social aspect, as I said, was about the consideration of people and relationships. So that's about things like human rights and labour standards. This is where Boohoo's slave wages comes into play. It's about gender and diversity. So are you hiring the best people regardless of their gender or their ethnicity, for example? And it's about community relations. So how do you pay back to your community? How do you try and lift up those around you rather than just focus on making money? The final section is governance. So this is where we actually already mainly look into ESG as lead pass investors, because under governance comes things like executive compensation. And this is a key part of our analysis of companies, is how much is the CEO being paid. But it extends past that. It's how is the board composed? Are the members of the board and the management of the company, are they taking bribes? Are they corrupt, or are they being ethically upright in their activities? And then it's things all the way out to what are their political contributions and views? Do they contribute to a political party that you think does good in the world or does evil in the world? It starts to come into such a wide variety of things. Now, this here is a non-exhaustive list, and one website I looked at said that they measure 450 plus ESG metrics and give them scores and grades. So as I say, this is a massively expanding area where people are starting to try and get a grip on what effect companies have in the wider world other than just the profit that they generate. And these ESG metrics are beginning to be enforced by governments. Legislation is starting to be brought in, and penalties are starting to be paid out for people who don't meet certain metrics. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. But why, as investors, do we want to bother with this ESG stuff? Surely it's just fine to leave the companies to sort it out and they'll work with the legislation and that's that. Well, there's a few good reasons to bother about it. First of all, it would allow us to have sustainable strategies in managing our portfolio that would align our investments with a long-term trend towards sustainability and towards better social management and better governance. This could mean that we would do better with our investments. It also allows us to hedge our investments. That's the wrong kind of hedge. I mean the financial hedge, where we can have better sorts of risk analysis. We can consider things like future potential legislation that against activities that we already know are not great for the environment or for society, but are technically currently legal, but might not be in the future. So that's potential things like Facebook and Google being allowed to sell our data to advertisers. That's technically legal at the moment, but potentially might not be in the future. And finally, it's worth thinking about ESG because the best companies are thinking about ESG. So this graph shows the return on invested capital, as I just said earlier, one of our key metrics at Lead Pass Investment, against the quintile of how ESG adherent various companies are. And the graph shows that the companies that are most adhering to ESG standards at the moment are performing almost 30% better than the companies who aren't. Now, this is not indicative of a one-to-one causal relationship where paying attention to ESG standards means that you do better as a company, but at the very least it shows us that the best companies are starting to pay attention to this, and so should we. Now, how do we bring ESG into our investments? There's a number of different ways we can do it. The first one is with screening. So we could filter out certain companies based on ESG standards that we choose to pay attention to. And as I said, we already start to do this in our currently past investment strategy when we take a look at how much the CEO is paid in comparison to what the company does. And we often discount companies if we think the CEO is being paid too much for how little he's doing. But there's a wide range of different ways you can screen. We could build in a full integration, and this would be where our valuation of the company changes based on some set of ESG standards that we choose. So at the moment, our valuation of companies is predicated on their current earnings per share, future price to earnings, and various levels of growth that we look at. But we could start to build into that something like the price changing based on the amount of CO2 that a company produces, or how much it contributes to political activism. Any number of things could be brought in to quantify what we perceive to be a change in valuation, and that would change the price at which we would be willing to buy that company. As I've said already, we could allow ESG standards to guide how we manage our portfolio. We could weight our categories, weight our investments differently, whatever it might be. But that's another way we can manage our investments with ESG. And finally, we could look at thematic investing. So we know that Chelsea and Seb are very interested in green energy, so they want to invest in green energy producing companies. That's a type of thematic investing based on ESG standards because they care deeply about the environment. But it could be something as wide-ranging as investing in companies that support political movements that you believe in, like Black Lives Matter or whatever it might be. So all of these are different ways that you can start to bring in all those hundreds and hundreds of different ESG metrics in whatever way you like. So you can see there's a wide variety of different ways to include it. I just want to look at a couple of examples of companies that got screwed over by not paying attention to ESG standards as they should have done. So Pacific Gas and Electric Company had to declare bankruptcy in 2019 due to costs associated with climate change-induced wildfires that they were found to have some partial responsibility for. They couldn't bear those costs. Tyson Food Group is being sued, or was sued during 2020 for wrongful death due to their forcing employees to come to work with COVID-19 symptoms, and on top of that, not providing proper PPE protection for them. Now, they are a food producer and they were forcing sick people to come and produce food. That in itself is a huge issue, but also people ended up dying there, which is on top of further a massive problem. And Wells Fargo is a bank in America who had to lay off in 2016 5,000 different employees who were found to have been making fake accounts to move money around and create false transactions such that they could reach sales targets that had been placed on them by their management. Now, that's an example of environmental ESG, social ESG, and governance ESG that companies didn't adhere to and ended up doing poorly because of. Now, I want to just end briefly on talking about greenwashing. We talked earlier about that the fact that these ESG standards are starting to be enforced by legislation. And what that means is companies are starting to try and find ways that they can just shove in stuff into their annual reports, into their reporting, that makes them look like they're meeting these metrics. So when you're doing your analysis, if you care about this sort of thing, and you, as I say, you probably should, you need to take a deeper look and figure out what are things that the companies are actually doing that genuinely make an impact for the better, and what are ones that are just shoved in there to make them look good. Does anyone have any questions?